Sara Solovitch, welcome to Beyond Stage Fright. Now, you've written a book called Playing Scared, My Journey Through Stage Fright. And it's about how you loved the piano as a child, but you had really crippling stage fright, which really stopped any aspirations you had for a career in music. Now, in your late 50s, you decided that you were going to take a year to see whether you could tame your stage fright and perform in a formal recital in front of 50 people at the end of the year. You went to all sorts of different therapists, teachers, and explored loads of different therapies. Can you start off by telling me, first of all, giving me a general overview of your main discoveries throughout the year?
When I first began this journey, I realized immediately that it was a rich idea, and it just intrigued me intellectually and emotionally, and it set me on a course in which I was really able to explore everything I was really interested in. But I was terrified that I couldn't do it. And for a long time during the process, I kept doing exactly what I had done all my life, which was to put off performing. And I just found every opportunity to say no and not to perform, even in front of a few people, because I always thought, okay, in next month I'll do it, next week. Eventually was, of course, that I had to do it. I had to leap in and do it. And that was the very scariest thing. But once I finally did it, as awful as it was sometimes, it started to become more commonplace. And I was able to accept that I wasn't going to die, and I would survive one way or another, and I could manage to do it. And that ultimately became a very kind of powerful concept for me and allowed me to just move through it and open myself up to exploring all these things that had been really, abstract and intellectual, and, I could understand them, as an ideal, but I couldn't put them into practice for me. So it was ultimately just forcing myself to do something that I had avoided my entire life.
What would you say were the key strategies that made a difference to you that you discovered during that year?
The main thing was actually going and doing it and finding opportunities to do it. Going and playing at the airport, having little soirees and inviting people over and performing for them. But also, of course, once, I managed to do those things, it was the deep breathing. It was the the Alexander technique really helped me, I think, because it allowed me to just think about breathing in a way that I really never had. I mean, you think, well, who has to learn how to breathe? But there is something, even now, you just forget and you breathe in this very shallow way most of the time, at least I know I do. And just to bring a real consciousness into that affects, so much of how we feel. There were, just all kinds of psychological, thoughts that I learned how to bring to it. The psychologists that I talked to that helped me understand, what had stopped me along the way. And ultimately, Betablockers too were very significant, kind of used in a strategic way. I know it's very controversial among musicians, even today, which seems crazy to me. But it certainly didn't seem to tamp down my excitement. It only allowed me to, approach it, to be able to perform finally after decades of not doing so. What they did was allow me to finally access my rational brain and, just be calm enough so that I could kind of gather my wits and kind of address and remember and think about what I was doing and not become this, just emotional basket case. It allowed me to really focus. So many people discouraged me from doing that, especially, in the in the music world, but also in the, the sports world and, many other people. And I nevertheless had to really think about myself and how I respond in this situation and not the ideal of how one is supposed to respond.
You mentioned something about the psychology and how you learnt about yourself through the whole year. Tell me a little bit more about that. What did you discover that had made it very difficult for you to perform in public?
I once met a violinist who, said that whenever she performed, instead of hearing the music, she heard her father's voice. And for me, whenever I, played in public, my mother was there. She was the audience and the ultimate, judge of how I did. One psychologist, a transpersonal psychologist named Susan Rayburn, told me was that I had to make this my own. I had to make the music my own, I had to make the project my own, and it could have nothing to do with my mother. And if I was going back to it, it had to be on my own terms.
Because I read in your book that your mother was actually quite ferocious at times. I mean, she had wooden spoons that she chased you around the kitchen with if you weren't practicing. I mean, do you think that had an impact?
When I think about the past and what had the impact, it was much more her presence in the audience and her reactions to me after the fact when I didn't perform as she had hoped and what she wanted for me. It was much more her coldness afterwards and her disfavor and her withholding than the actual the ferocity that she brought to my practice. That I could laugh at, and I always was able to laugh at, and it was something that was just kind of like, kind of the dynamics of the house, and it was done in a way with humor. I mean, we would both be laughing as we were running around the dining room table, but it was always more the lack of, what I perceived as a kind of lack, a withholding of love that bothered me much more, and still I retain that.
You studied and worked with some really key people during that year. One of them was Noah Kagayama, who is a performance coach at the Juilliard, and you worked with him for quite a while, didn't you? And I wanted to know, could you just tell me a little bit about how you worked with him and what really helped you from that experience?
Well, he's very practical, and he wasn't at all interested in hearing about my past, really, and about my psychology and my upbringing, and none of that was really, of any import to him. It was about just addressing how to go forward. And so we would Skype once a week, and they were very practical suggestions, and he would give me homework, and sometimes we would even do things during the hour that we Skyped. I mean, he would send me out to go on a run and then, run over to my piano without taking any breath in preparation and just start playing. So I had that feeling of breathlessness, or, doing jumping jacks and then sitting down at the piano. So it was that sense of gathering all your, when you're out of breath and feeling panicked, or in this case it wasn't panicked, but just kind of exhausted and out of breath, and then drawing all your resources together and focusing and kind of channeling your concentration to the piano. That was, kind of, I think, one of the, really helpful things that he had me do. But he just really was very encouraging and just saw it as something that was within anybody's ability to do, and, gave me, made it like an adventure. So that was very helpful. He would have me, draw up a list of the things that were, the 10 biggest, adventures of my life, and then put that, in, and, kind of figure out how to see it differently. And in fact, that's that is what I did. I went to a piano camp in which I would perform on a regular basis, and I would play in master classes and play at the airport, and play for different teachers' recitals. I mean, any opportunity I had, I just started performing.
The other person I'd like to hear a little bit about is Don Green, who's a sports and music psychologist. And I know that you worked with him, it was just before your recital, wasn't it? Could you tell me a little bit more about how you worked with Don?
He was truly a sports psychologist. Don was not a musician. He had never played an instrument. He was an athlete. And he had also gone to, he had been a Green Beret, and he had gone to West Point Academy. And so he had had this very rigorous military education. And he really came at it through that. And he kind of lectured and talked, and was kind of this gung-ho militaristic approach. And it was a little shocking for me, frankly, because I had never confronted this. I had never been, like a really disciplined athlete in any way. And that was, kind of how he barraged me with these kinds of, tactics. And, you will do this. You must do this. And it was very different. But I think in terms of leading up, it was just this kind of mysterious kind of, I don't know, this thrust forward that he gave me that allowed me to just feel like, whoa, like just pushed me ahead. And that was a very, I'm really grateful to him. I think he gave me something kind of, that I couldn't quite put my finger on, but was very helpful.
Now you've written the book and you've given that recital, do you feel you can cope with performance anxiety?
Well, it comes and goes. It's not something that I can take for granted and think, oh, I've done all the work, and so now I'm always going to be fine, because it's not like that at all. It's that every time I have to really, kind of psych myself up and prepare myself, and even then, it's not a sure thing. Sometimes I'm really fine with it, and there are moments that I just love it and enjoy it, and other times I just kind of have to suck it up and be, content that if I make mistakes, I'll still live, and it's just not a case of walking through the door and waving goodbye and saying, I'm all over my anxieties forever. It's not that kind of thing, and probably no anxiety is like that, whether it's crossing a bridge or fear of heights or anything like that. I think that these kinds of things are so ingrained in us, and they're so much who we are, and we can, kind of live with them. But at least from my experience, no, it's not something that I've gotten over.
Tell me what your view of performance anxiety is.
I think it's a very natural response to something which is a high-stakes situation. And whether, you're a professional musician and it's your entire life, and your performance kind of, everything hinges on each performance, or whether it's just, something like, someone like me who's very much an amateur and just wants to keep music in our lives, and, still have standards of excellence that we aspire to. I think, for each of us, we have, it's a high stakes situation. And so, of course, it's natural that we respond in such a big way to something that means something to us. And we're standing, outside and, the group, and we're demanding attention and saying, look at me, I'm special, or what I'm doing is special and it deserves attention, and everybody should be looking at me and watching me and listening to me and not saying a word while I'm doing this, marvelous thing that I've been working and working for. And, here I am. I mean, of course, it's, we should give ourselves a break and say, it's just enough that we're willing to put ourselves out there. You have all this criticism for yourself. I continue to have, and this little, judgmental editor or, critic on my shoulder telling me that was a mistake. You didn't play that properly. And people don't hear that. And they come up and they're just so full of gratitude and, and emotion. And they're so touched by the music, and also how you expose yourself, and make yourself vulnerable before them. It's very, so many people never do. And when you actually allow yourself to open a little bit, people really appreciate it.
And what would you say your best experience of performing has been?
There's been a couple. There's, the library performance was really wonderful. I just felt like I was kind of on a high during it and after it. I just felt that something had lifted for me. And there have been a couple since then. There was a soiree I did at my house. I've continued to perform. And there was one I did a couple months ago that I just felt, again, like something had lifted, and that I was so... And it gets back to what Don Green and Noah Kageyama spoke to. It's about just where you kind of become so focused and centered, and you're just in a whole other, like realm. And it's, you hear the music and you're part of the music and you're not really thinking anymore. And those are wonderful moments. But, I recently spoke to a class of music students, and the teacher, who was a professional pianist, said to me afterwards that, she's played all over the world, and she said that she's only had maybe 8 of those her entire life. And you just can't depend upon that. And it's like, being a writer, when you don't wait until you have, insight, or, you feel really, like inspired to sit down and write. You just sit down and write every day. And maybe it'll come to you, those moments of inspiration will come, and maybe they won't, but you still make the practice of sitting down and doing it every day. And it's the same thing for performing. I mean, you can't expect to, be focused and channeled and centered. You can't expect to be centered like that every time you sit down and perform. So that, in that sense, I think it's a great thing to aspire to, but you can't depend upon it, because it's, sometimes, it'll happen, but it's not going to be there for you all the time. It's something that you want, but good luck.
Sara Solovitch, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Thank you, Charlotte.